There's a certain silence that comes with being home, a peace that's almost foreign after spending so much time in the field. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of leaves outside the window. It's a kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, a reminder that life, real life, is still out there somewhere. I was in the middle of savoring one of those rare moments of stillness with Emily when the phone rang. It was one of those rings that cuts through everything, slicing the calm like a knife through butter. I knew even before I answered that whatever peace I'd found was about to be shattered. Hank's voice came through the line, steady as ever, but there was an edge to it, a kind of tension that wasn't usually there. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He never did. "Ranger, we've got a situation. Wheels up in 2 hours. It's bad." That was all I needed to hear. The unspoken understanding that comes with years of working together told me this was different from our usual operations. No time for questions, no time for doubts. I hung up the phone, my mind already shifting gears, leaving behind the comfort of my home and slipping back into the cold, calculated mindset of the mission. Emily watched me pack, her eyes a mixture of concern and acceptance. She knew the drill by now, had long since made peace with the fact that our life together would always be punctuated by these sudden, unplanned departures. "Be careful," she whispered as I zipped up my bag. I nodded, but we both knew that careful didn't always mean safe. There were too many variables, too many unknowns in my line of work. All I could do was promise to come back, and hope that this time I'd be able to keep that promise. The team was already assembled by the time I arrived at the airstrip. Hank was there, of course, leaning against the side of the C-130 with that calm, unflappable demeanor of his. Blake was cracking jokes, trying to lighten the mood, while Eli fiddled with his equipment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Dr. Foster, the newcomer, looked out of place, too clean, too soft for what was ahead. And Mac, our pilot, gave me a nod as I approached, his thick mustache twitching with a hint of a smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hank briefed us on the mission as the plane roared to life. The Alaskan wilderness, he said, with its freezing temperatures and remote location, had become the site of something disturbing. People, animals, everything living in that area was showing signs of some kind of cellular degeneration. There were reports of mutations, bodies twisted into grotesque forms, and an unknown force responsible for it all. Our job was to go in, assess the situation, and bring back whatever intel we could. It sounded straightforward enough on paper, but we all knew that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The flight was long and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling back to the details Hank had shared, trying to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. What could cause such rapid degeneration? And why here, in the middle of nowhere? There were no easy answers, just a growing sense of unease that gnawed at me the closer we got to our destination. When we finally touched down, the landscape that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. Snow as far as the eye could see, trees bowed under the weight of it, and in the distance, an ancient cabin that looked like it had been plucked from another time. It was the kind of place that felt wrong, as if it had been forgotten by the world for a reason. The wind howled around us as we trudged through the snow, our breath visible in the frigid air. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the white landscape, its windows like empty eyes staring back at us. Inside, the cabin was no more welcoming than it had been from the outside. The wood creaked under our weight, the air thick with the smell of damp and decay. It was clear this place had been abandoned for a long time, but there were signs that someone, or something, had been here recently. A broken chair, a few scattered papers, and the unmistakable sense of being watched. Eli set up his equipment in the corner, while Blake and Hank started securing the perimeter. Dr. Foster hovered near the fireplace, his face pale and drawn, clearly unnerved by our surroundings. As night fell, the storm that had been brewing all day finally hit, trapping us in the cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. We huddled around the small fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The sense of isolation was palpable, the kind of isolation that gets under your skin and stays there. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. We were alone, cut off from the rest of the world, with only the storm and the dark woods for company. It was sometime after midnight when we first heard it, a sound that didn't belong, echoing through the trees. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was clear it wasn't just the wind. The others heard it too. Blake's joke stopped, Eli's fingers froze on his keyboard, and even Hank's calm facade cracked just a little. We grabbed our gear and moved to the windows, scanning the dark, snow-covered woods for any sign of movement. The sound came again, closer this time, sending a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Whatever it was out there, and it was getting closer. The kind of closer that means trouble. We were miles from the nearest town, deep in the wilderness, with no one but ourselves to rely on. And as the sound drew nearer, one thing became painfully clear. We weren't alone. The night pressed in on us, thick and suffocating, as the wind howled relentlessly outside the cabin. Inside, the air was tense, a coiled spring waiting to snap. We could all feel it, the presence of something out there, just beyond the reach of our lights. Hank's voice was low and steady as he gave out orders, his calm masking the same unease that gnawed at the rest of us. Blake and I were to take first watch, while Eli stayed inside to monitor our comms, which had been acting up since we landed. Dr. Foster, pale and jittery, was supposed to rest, but his wide eyes said that sleep was the last thing on his mind. We stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching under our boots, and the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. The cabin's dim lights barely pierced the night, leaving the woods around us a black void. Blake was silent for once, his usual easygoing banter replaced by a focused intensity. We took up positions on either side of the cabin, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The wind carried strange sounds, the kind that set your teeth on edge. Rustling, snapping, and something else, something that didn't belong. I tightened my grip on my rifle, every nerve on high alert. Then I saw him. A man staggering out of the woods, barely more than a shadow in the snow. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the night, a figure conjured by my tired mind. But as he came closer, stumbling through the drifts, I knew he was real. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, eyes wide with terror. He was muttering something, words that were lost to the wind. I called out to Blake, and we moved toward the man, weapons raised, but not aimed, cautious but ready. As we approached, the man collapsed, falling into the snow like a puppet with its strings cut. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were patches of dark, discolored flesh spreading across his neck and arms. Whatever he'd been through, it had left him on the edge of death. I knelt beside him, trying to make sense of the garbled words spilling from his cracked lips. He was trying to warn us, but before he could finish, a shot rang out, the sharp crack splitting the night. Blake and I hit the ground instinctively, our training kicking in before our minds could catch up. We searched for the source of the shot, our eyes darting through the darkness. That's when we saw them, figures moving through the trees, fast and deliberate. These weren't random wanderers lost in the storm. They were hunters, and we were their prey. Another shot whizzed past, close enough to feel the air ripple, and we returned fire, our bullets disappearing into the shadows. The firefight was chaotic, a blur of sound and movement. Blake's voice crackled in my ear, relaying positions, while I focused on keeping the attackers pinned down. Whoever they were skilled, well-trained, well-armed, and relentless. But something was off. In the brief flashes of muzzle fire, I caught glimpses of their faces, and they were wrong. Pale, distorted, like the man we had found. It wasn't just the cold that was killing them. It was something else, something inside, eating them alive. We managed to push them back, driving them into the woods, but the damage was done. The man we'd found was dead, his body already beginning to show the same signs of decay as our attackers. I couldn't shake the image of his face, twisted in fear and pain. Blake and I hauled his body inside the cabin, where Dr. Foster took one look and recoiled, his hand clamping over his mouth. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything we'd been prepared for. Hank's jaw tightened as he examined the body, his usual calm slipping just a bit. "They're infected," he muttered, more to himself than to us. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. If these men were infected, then we were dealing with more than just a hostile force. We were facing something biological, something that didn't just kill but corrupted. And if it could do this to them, what chance did we have? We didn't have long to dwell on it. The storm was closing in, and our communications were still down. Eli was working frantically to re-establish a link with HQ, but the interference was getting worse. It was as if the very air around us was charged with some malevolent force, disrupting everything. Blake tried to joke about it, something about how the trees were out to get us, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The truth was sinking in. We were cut off, surrounded, and facing an enemy we didn't understand. As the hours dragged on, the noises outside grew louder. The wind wasn't just howling anymore. It was screaming, carrying with it the distant sounds of something moving through the snow. I found myself staring out the window, straining to see beyond the darkness. Every shadow looked like it was moving, every creak of the wood a sign of something creeping closer. The man's face kept flashing before my eyes, a constant reminder of what was out there, waiting for us. Then, just before dawn, we saw them. Figures barely visible in the swirling snow, just at the edge of the woods. They didn't move like normal men. There was something off, something that sent a primal fear shooting through my veins. They didn't advance, didn't attack, just stood there, watching us. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone, and that was almost worse than if they'd charged the cabin. The tension inside was palpable, everyone on edge, waiting for the inevitable. Hank kept us focused, kept us from panicking, but even he couldn't hide the truth. We weren't just up against an enemy we didn't understand. We were up against something that defied understanding. And as the first light of day struggled to break through the storm, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was out there, whatever had infected those men, wasn't done with us yet. Dawn broke with little fanfare, the dim light barely piercing the thick veil of the storm that still raged around us. The figures that had haunted us through the night had disappeared back into the woods, leaving only the tracks in the snow as proof they had been there at all. But we knew better than to think they were gone. They were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. Every instinct I had screamed that we needed to move, to get out of this place before it was too late. Hank felt it too. He gathered us around the cabin's tiny table, his voice low but urgent as he laid out our plan. "We head back to the plane," he said, his eyes scanning each of us in turn, making sure we understood the gravity of what he was saying. "We can't stay here. Whatever's out there, it's only going to get worse." No one argued. The memory of those twisted, infected men was fresh in our minds, and the knowledge that the storm wasn't letting up only added to the urgency. Staying here meant certain death, or worse, becoming like them. Packing up was a grim affair. Dr. Foster, who had hardly slept, was pale and shaking, but he moved with a determination I hadn't seen in him before. Even Eli, usually so methodical, worked with a speed that bordered on frantic. Blake was uncharacteristically quiet, his face drawn and tense. As we prepared to leave, I caught him wincing as he adjusted the strap on his pack. It wasn't until we were outside, trudging through the snow, that I noticed the dark stains spreading across his jacket, a deep, angry red against the white. "Blake, what happened?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He tried to brush it off, but there was no hiding the pain in his eyes. "Just a scratch," he muttered, but the way he was holding his side told a different story. I moved closer, pulling his hand away to reveal a deep gash running along his ribcage, the skin around it already starting to discolor. My heart sank. The cut was bad, but it was the way the flesh around it seemed to be darkening, spreading like a bruise with a mind of its own, that really scared me. "Shit, Blake," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "When did this happen?" He shook his head, dismissing my concern with a wave of his hand. "It's nothing. One of those bastards caught me last night. But I'm fine. We just need to get the hell out of here." I didn't believe him for a second, but there was no time to argue. The figures from the night before might be gone, but the feeling that we were being hunted hadn't left. We had to move, and fast. The trek back to the plane was brutal. The storm had worsened overnight, turning the already difficult terrain into a death trap. The snow was knee-deep in places, the wind whipping it into our faces, blinding us as we stumbled forward. Every step was a battle, and every time I looked back at Blake, I could see him struggling more and more to keep up. Hank led the way, his pace relentless, but I knew he was pushing us for a reason. We had to make it to the plane before those things caught up to us, or we'd never make it out alive. It wasn't long before the sounds started again. At first, they were distant, just on the edge of hearing. A low moan carried on the wind, the crunch of snow under too many feet. But as we got closer to the plane, they grew louder, more insistent. They were closing in, moving faster than we were. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced it down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The plane was our only chance, our only hope of getting out of this nightmare. When we finally reached the clearing where the plane was parked, my heart sank. The storm had buried it under a thick layer of snow, and worse, there were tracks everywhere, deep, erratic prints that circled the plane, leading away into the woods. Whatever had attacked us at the cabin had found the plane during the night, and I could only pray that Mac was still alive. Hank signaled for us to spread out, to check the area before we moved any closer, but there was no time. The sounds were right behind us now, a chorus of guttural noises that set my teeth on edge. We burst into the clearing, our weapons at the ready, but there was no one to shoot. The plane's door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, and inside we found Mac slumped over the controls, his body cold and still. The infected had gotten to him, just as they had the others. Hank cursed under his breath, but there was no time to mourn. We had to get the plane in the air, or we'd end up just like Mac. Eli moved to the controls, his hands shaking as he tried to make sense of them, while the rest of us kept watch. Then, just as we were about to start the engines, Blake collapsed. He fell into the snow, clutching his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wound had gotten worse, much worse. The dark discoloration had spread across his chest, the veins around it standing out in stark relief, pulsing with some unnatural energy. Hank and I lifted him into the plane, his weight almost too much to bear, and Dr. Foster immediately started working on him, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Blake wasn't just injured. He was infected, just like the men who had attacked us. Eli finally got the engines started, the roar of them cutting through the sounds of the infected as they emerged from the woods, their twisted forms barely recognizable as human. We didn't wait for them to get any closer. The plane lurched forward, struggling to gain speed on the snow-covered ground, but we had no choice. It was now or never. I watched through the window as the infected figures stumbled after us, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes locked on us with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. The plane lifted off just as they reached the clearing, their hands grasping at the air where we had been moments before. I slumped back in my seat, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, my mind struggling to process everything that had happened. Blake was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin turning an unnatural shade of gray. Dr. Foster was doing everything he could, but we all knew the truth. Whatever was inside him was winning. As we flew away from that frozen hell, leaving the infected in the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. We had escaped, but at what cost? Blake was dying, or worse, turning into one of those things, and there was nothing any of us could do about it. The plane's engines droned on, a constant reminder of how far we still had to go and how little time we had left. All I could do was pray that we'd reach base before the infection took him, but deep down, I knew it was a prayer that might not be answered. The hum of the plane's engines was a low, constant drone, a fragile lifeline that separated us from the horrors we'd left behind. We were in the air, but it felt like we were suspended in a kind of limbo, caught between the hellish nightmare of the Alaskan wilderness and the uncertainty of what awaited us back at base. The cold of the cabin still clung to my bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep in my gut, an unshakable sense that something terrible was just around the corner. Blake lay across the seats, barely conscious, his breathing labored and wet. Dr. Foster hovered over him, doing what he could, but the infection was spreading too fast. The wound on Blake's side had taken on a life of its own, the dark, pulsing veins creeping further across his chest and up his neck. His skin was no longer just discolored. It was changing, taking on a sickly hue that reminded me too much of the infected we fought off. Every breath he took was a struggle, every exhale a reminder that time was slipping away from us. Hank sat across from me, his face a mask of stone, but I could see the worry etched into the lines around his eyes. He didn't say much. He never did in times like this. But the way he kept glancing at Blake told me everything I needed to know. We were in trouble, deeper than any of us had ever been before. We'd faced enemies with guns and bombs, but this was something different. Something that didn't just kill, it corrupted, twisted the very essence of what made us human. Eli was in the cockpit, his hand shaking slightly as he guided the plane through the turbulent skies. The storm had lessened, but the winds were still strong, buffeting us around like a toy in a giant's hands. He was doing his best to get us back to base as quickly as possible, but the tension in his voice when he radioed in for medical support told me he knew it might not be fast enough. "We need a quarantine team ready when we land," he had said, his voice tight with barely contained fear. "And they'd better bring everything they've got." The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the hours stretching into an eternity. I kept my eyes on Blake, watching as the infection consumed him inch by inch. His eyes fluttered open occasionally, glazed and unfocused, his lips moving as if he was trying to say something, but no words came out. I wanted to reach out, to tell him it was going to be okay, but the lie stuck in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to say it because I didn't believe it myself. When we finally touched down at the base, it felt like we were coming back to a different world. The warmth of the desert air was a stark contrast to the freezing cold we'd left behind, but there was no relief in it. The hangar was already filled with personnel, medics in hazmat suits waiting with stretchers and containment units. As the plane rolled to a stop, the doors were flung open and they rushed in, their movements precise and practiced, but there was an underlying urgency that couldn't be missed. They moved Blake first, lifting him onto a stretcher with as much care as they could manage. His body jerked slightly as they strapped him down, his eyes rolling back in his head. Dr. Foster tried to explain what had happened, but the lead medic cut him off, his tone clipped. "We'll take it from here, Doctor. You all need to be decontaminated immediately." There was no room for argument, no time for questions. They whisked Blake away, his stretcher disappearing into the back of an armored transport, the doors slamming shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The rest of us were herded into a quarantine area, stripped of our gear, and subjected to a thorough decontamination process. The water was scalding, the chemicals they sprayed on us stinging my skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was still back on that plane, watching Blake's body being consumed by something we couldn't fight. The images of the infected men in the woods, their twisted faces, their contorted bodies, played on a loop in my head. And underneath it all, The question that gnawed at me, the one I couldn't shake, was Blake already gone? Had we lost him before we even left Alaska? Hours passed before they finally let us out, handing us clean clothes and ushering us into a briefing room. Hank was the first to speak, his voice gravelly and tired as he laid out what had happened, the details we hadn't had time to discuss on the plane. The room was silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in with every word he spoke. The infection, the mutations, the possibility that it could spread beyond the confines of that frozen wasteland. It was too much to comprehend, but we had to try, had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. Eli was next, his voice shaky as he recounted the communications breakdown, the way the storm had cut us off from the outside world. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes hollow, but there was a resolve in him that hadn't been there before. "We can't let this spread," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find out what caused it, how it works, and we need to do it fast." The meeting broke up after that, each of us left to grapple with the reality of what we'd been through. There was no talk of victory, no sense of relief at having made it back. We were alive, but we weren't safe. Not yet. As I left the briefing room, the weight of it all bore down on me, heavy and suffocating. I knew there would be more missions, more dangers, but this one was different. This one had changed something in all of us. I found myself standing outside the quarantine area, staring at the doors where they had taken Blake. A medic passed by, and I stopped him, desperate for any news. He hesitated, his eyes darting away before he finally spoke. "He's stable," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "We're doing everything we can." I nodded, but the words felt hollow, like they were meant to reassure, not inform. The truth was, none of us knew what was going to happen next. As I walked away, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something terrible. Blake's fate was uncertain, but it wasn't just him. It was all of us. The infection had followed us home, buried deep in our minds, if not our bodies, and I knew, deep down, that it wasn't done with us yet. The mission was over, but the real fight was just beginning.